Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. And more importantly, welcome to Season 6. As you may have noticed, the podcast has gotten a bit of an upgrade. I got a new cover photo, I got a new intro. I'm really excited about the new direction. Well, it's not really a new direction, but a shift, a more clarity in what I want this podcast to do for you listeners. If you're new here, before I became a licensed psychotherapist, I was a depth-oriented coach for almost a decade. And I have taught, and I've explored many concepts on how to navigate the complexities of being human. So in this podcast, I hope to offer ways of thinking differently about popular concepts so that you can figure out what is going to be most supportive for you. Every episode, I reclaim one topic, and today I want to talk about acceptance, because this is a very popular, prevalent idea in self-help and pop psychology. I think if we have been doing any type of work within ourselves, we may have heard or may have wanted to experience some level of acceptance of a difficult situation or an self-acceptance, right? With this fantasy, with this idea that to accept ourselves means that we no longer experience self-loathing. And well, it doesn't feel good to hate ourselves. It doesn't feel good to experience so much shame about our inner lives. It does not feel good to be so paralyzed by thoughts of the ways in which we hate ourselves, dislike ourselves, and are displeased with how we are in the world. And so the hope in cultivating self-acceptance is that then we are no longer so burdened by those difficult feelings and can move forward and do the things that we want to do. Now, I'm not saying that fantasy is not kind of, I'm not saying that the fantasy is wrong, right? Like, I do think that self-acceptance can offer a lot of freedom for us. But I want to spend some time kind of dissecting and exploring this concept, because for me personally, when I first read this idea of self-acceptance, it became very intellectualized. It became very much like this fantastical idea that I really wanted to embody in my life. And so I very quickly grasped onto it as something that I should be experiencing. And if I'm not experiencing acceptance or self-acceptance, then I'm doing it wrong. And so while the idea of self-acceptance comes at the core of a desire to be more open and more expansive with who we are and how life is, if we are coming at the self-help or kind of pop psych ideas, if we're coming at it with a lot of self-loathing, these ideas kind of gets attached to our critical ego, and then we just now find ourselves criticizing ourselves for not accepting, which defeats the whole purpose, right? The point of self-acceptance, the point of accepting the things that are happening in our lives, is to create more space for it, not to become another tool or another weapon that we wield against ourselves. But that's often what I find happens, especially if we're overachievers, especially if we're intellectualizers. Especially if we're so committed to this path, it can be very easy for these ideas to then turn against ourselves. And now it just becomes another thing that we hate ourselves for. Now I don't just experience shame and self-loathing for not having responded to the situation the way I wanted. But now I'm going to experience self-loathing for not being able to accept myself for how I had responded, right? So it just becomes like another layer. I believe this is kind of maybe possibly what Buddha had in mind when he talked about the double-edged sword, or the ways in which we then not only get upset ourselves for what we have done, but then we get upset ourselves for being upset with ourselves. It's this like double hit where there's so much shame on top of shame. And I think the idea somewhere in our minds, we hope that through enough self-criticism, through enough self-loathing, through enough attacking of ourselves, we will shipshape. We will become who we want to be. And what's frustrating is that it doesn't actually really work. It just, I think, creates more disconnect in our hearts. But we can maybe really empathize with that desire, because it's so seductive. It's so brilliantly, omnipotently, magical thinkingly exciting to think that with just enough lashing against ourselves, with just enough derision and enough loathing and attacking, we are going to finally become who we want to be. We're going to finally kind of willpower our way through life, and we're going to finally succeed. And it can feel so frustrating when that doesn't happen. So I want to talk a little bit about all of the ways in which maybe how we're thinking about self-acceptance may actually be not creating a space that's conducive for self-acceptance to happen. There's a quote that I read that inspired this topic in my mind, and it's by a teacher called Tara Brach that I really respect. I really love Tara Brach's teachings. Her podcast has been very instrumental for me, and I have really loved how she creates such digestible, applicable ways that we can incorporate psychology and Buddhism in our lives. And when I read this quote, I immediately got in touch with the ways in which people can very easily use this quote in the wrong way. So let me share the quote with you. She goes, "What would it be like if I could accept life, accept this moment exactly as it is?" Brilliant. This is very kind of in alignment with Buddhism, right? If you've read any Buddhist philosophers and any books on Buddhism, like this is such a tenet of Buddhist philosophy. What would it be like if we could accept life fully as it is? And I imagine that part of that question is meant to then evoke the feelings that would guide us into self-acceptance. So if we were to think about accepting life fully as it is, maybe we would feel a little bit more compassion for ourselves. Maybe we would feel a little bit calmer. Maybe we would feel a little bit less in fight flight, right? Maybe if we could accept who we are exactly as we are right now, we would feel more love, more freedom. Maybe we would feel more joy. Maybe we would be able to see the beauty of the moment instead of being so scared of the bad things in the moment. I like this idea that like God delights in giving us all these beautiful things in the world, should we choose to see them. And I think that that's what that question evokes for me, like being able to smell the flowers or being able to take in all that is beautiful. I also think that quote really invites us into an exploration into what it means to truly live in the present moment. And all of these self-help and Buddhism and pop psych philosophies invite us often to engage in the present moment with a recognition that so much of our lives is spent in our minds, that takes us into the present or into the future, into anticipating what's gonna come, or in the past, which is really kind of ruminating or obsessing or reliving or rethinking like what has happened and the regrets and the frustrations of the past and the ways in which we wish that things were different, the moments that we were really embarrassed or really ashamed or mortified of the things that we've done. Right, we can spend a lot of time there. And what would happen if we spent more time in this moment? The ideal kind of fantasy is that if we were to be able to spend more time in this moment, we would also mean that we would be accepting more of what is happening right now. We would be more grounded in reality. We would be more here, more present, more spacious in this moment of time. And meditation and mindfulness practices are all baked into this idea that if we spend more of our time here and now in this moment, then we are actually spending more of our time in a state of acceptance, because you cannot truly be in reality or be in the moment and be in resistance to it. Because if we're in resistance to reality, what we're doing is we're actually in the past or anticipating the future. So these ideas are very intertwined, right? That when we live in the present moment, when we can accept things for what they are, that it's part of living in the present. And when we live in the present, we're actually then able to be more in touch with self-acceptance, as well as all these kind of more delicious internal feelings that we want to be having, such as self-love, happiness, pleasure. I think it's so easy to evoke moments of pleasure as moments where we were present, like when we are eating something really delicious, or having an orgasm, or laughing with our friends. Like when we're laughing, when we're fully here, that is when we're experiencing a tremendous amount of joy. So it makes a lot of sense that working towards acceptance, working towards living in the present could be really like a way in which we become more spacious. I think, though, okay, having said all that, I think the limitation that I've always struggled with when I endeavored in learning self-help and really wanted to embody these principles is how? How do we do this? Like, how do we live more in the present? And like, what does that actually even mean? What does it even mean to accept ourselves? Because all I knew was to accept ourselves is to be telling myself I should accept myself, right? Like that's as far as I got. So what does it mean to go from I know I should to I actually am? And I think what's hard is that we often overlook the ways in which we are already in acceptance of so much of ourselves, and we are in acceptance of so much of life. But because we are in acceptance of it and we've metabolized it and we are present to it, we don't even notice it. And I think that that's then hard to then, it's easy to then get very critical that we never accept ourselves, when in actuality, self-acceptance, I think, often feels like something that's so easy to slide into that we don't even notice that we're doing it. Like I imagine that you can name many things in your life that you found ways to accept, found ways to internalize as like, this is how it is. Simple things, big things, it doesn't matter. There's all sorts of ways in which I know for a fact we have all found ways to accept certain things. But again, I think we tend to overlook them because we think that self-acceptance means a type of feeling state, a type of perfect arrival that we then would never have to struggle with things again. I think we often imagine that self-acceptance is this like utopic land where then we never struggle with things again. Like if I were to accept that my body looks a certain way, then I'm never gonna struggle with weight. I'm never gonna struggle with moments of self-loathing. I'm never gonna look in the mirror again and hate what I see. So we tend to think of self-acceptance as like an arrival point. That means that we've kind of willpowered our way, right? We willpowered our way into self-acceptance, and now we're here, now we're accepting, everything's good, boom, done. Like, woo, accomplished. Gosh, if only it worked that way. What I tend to find is that self-acceptance is a thing that we slide in and out of. It's a state of mind or state of being, an experience of presence that we can dip our toes in. Sometimes you can dip our feet in. Sometimes we can dip our whole bodies in. And it becomes second nature. We don't even realize it's happening anymore. But more often than not, we're going to be getting out of that pond. We're not always going to be in that state. And it kind of defeats, I think, the purpose of the human experience to imagine that we just have to work through some of our more difficult things and then we're going to arrive and we're going to be done. And I think that that's also where some philosophical ideas, if we're not really kind of thinking it through, if we're just latching on to certain ideas because they sound seductive and not kind of grasp the entirety of the school of thought. Like Buddhism is a very vast and dense and complicated school of thought, but we tend to grasp onto certain tidbits of it, like the idea of enlightenment, and then we kind of stop thinking about it and we just like, nope, that's it. Then life is to reach enlightenment. It's to reach a higher level, and that's what I need to do. And I'm going to do it by self-accepting and by forcing it. And once I reach enlightenment, then I'm never going to struggle again. I have yet to find that that's true for anybody that I've encountered. I often find actually that that's kind of like it's a slightly boring way of relating to ourselves and relating to our lives, because it is going to put us in a constant state of strife, seeking something that's actually not kind of tenable for the majority of us, which is, I think, what is more realistic and what is more possible, and actually in some ways better, if I can name that, is this idea that it's about our relationship to enlightenment, or our relationship to the process of it, our relationship to the journey of it, that actually is, again, much more interesting to me than like this idea of kind of reaching it and being done. And then you're like, what, sit back and knit for the rest of your life? Like, life doesn't work that way. Life is filled with struggles and sufferings and pain and dilemmas and challenges and misunderstandings and frustrations. And it's really about learning how to navigate these things and developing relationship with these feelings that I think ultimately creates more space than kind of trying to cut ourselves off from all that it means to be human in order to try to continue to stay in this like perfect, aligned, enlightened space that is, again, impossible to hold for long. And then more times than not, when we're not able to be in that enlightened space, we're just like really upset at ourselves for not being there. So I have a lot of respect for a psychoanalyst called Bion, and he wrote this quote that I think can kind of help us a little bit more in terms of answering the question of how do we create more self-acceptance or acceptance in our lives? How do we kind of navigate this idea a little bit more deeply beyond just the willpower method? And he goes, the human experience, the human race is ill-equipped to tolerate its own experiential capacity. Whew, okay, so that's a little bit pessimistic, isn't it? Because what he's saying here is that we actually experience a whole lot in any given moment. We are constantly having internal experiences. And it's actually very, very hard for us to tolerate a lot of what's going on internally. We're not kind of, in a way, born equipped with it, for it. And we're going to need a lot of help, whether that's through through our upbringing with our parents, but also beyond, as adults. We're going to need a lot of help in processing the immense amount of internal and external stimuli. And we're not really equipped to it unless we continue to really get a lot of help in it. It's very hard to tolerate all that comes up. And while that quote is slightly more pessimistic than Tara Brach's quote or question, which I think is why people know more about Tara Brach than maybe they do know about Bion, what I appreciate about it is that he really names, this is a person who sat in front of, many, many, many people and have studied the human experience for many, many, many years. And he's essentially saying, listen, I sat with many people, and what I have found is that it's very hard to tolerate ourselves, and it's very hard to tolerate all that comes up for us. And this is a part of human nature. And maybe instead of trying to fight it, instead of trying to just accept or kind of just demand that it can be easy, that maybe part of what it means to live and to do this work is to name that this is hard and that we're going to struggle with this. There's another quote that I really liked by Eigen, who I don't know who he is. So I just saw this quote on Twitter. I know that maybe I'm not doing my good journalism work here, but I'm not a journalist, right? I'm a podcaster, so forgive me. But I really do like this quote. He goes, our productions, well, actually I don't even know if it's a he. So they go, our productions far outstrip our ability to handle them. We are taxed by the inner and outer worlds and must grow capacities to handle our creations. Oh my goodness. Wow. That Wow, I'm going to read it again. Our productions far outstrip our ability to handle them. We are taxed by the inner and outer worlds and must grow capacities to handle our creations. I think that quote and Beyond's quote, I think both of these quotes give us a little bit of insight into what it means to self-accept, what it means to accept reality, which is to say, first, we're naming that it's actually very hard to do. It's very hard. We can't actually handle much of reality. We really, really struggle. The human mind really struggles to handle much of reality. In fact, most of the time, we are not able to process and live in reality because reality is hard, reality is painful, because we don't have the right developmental skills from childhood, because we lack certain capacities. I mean, there's a myriad of reasons for why we have a hard time handling reality, and yet most of us really struggle to be fully in reality. Let alone, again, Tara's broad question of like being able to accept, being able to be in reality all of the time. That is a really big demand for us. And I think what these two quotes are trying to invite is that's actually very hard. And it's okay that it's very hard. It's kind of part of the human experience. This is what it is. And that the work towards self-acceptance, or the work towards being able to expand our capacity to tolerate reality, will be the work to expand our capacity to be with ourselves and to be with what is around us, is what it means to move into self-acceptance. Self-acceptance is not about cutting out what we don't like so that we live in this narrow world of what we do like. Self-acceptance is about being able to cultivate the capacity to be with all that is, as well as understand that we're actually very ill-equipped for this, and that this is going to be a continual process. And so, it can be really hard to find this process of self-acceptance, because so often when I am sitting in front of patients and they're talking about things that they want to accept, it often comes in many ways out of a kind of self-defeatist space. Oftentimes when we're touching into this desire of wanting to accept, this is what's happened. We are struggling with something. We're really frustrated by that something. We're really having a hard time with that something. And so then we go, I wish I could just accept that this is the way that it is. I should just accept this. And so it's a defeatist place, like maybe I should just accept that I'm broken. And that's not what we're talking about here as self-acceptance, because self-acceptance, it does not come out of a giving up. Like, self-acceptance is a process it's actually hard work. It's not easy to do. It's not just like, I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and just accept that this is who I am. Like, fuck it. That's just not what self-acceptance looks like. And when we do that, when we're coming out of this self-defeatist attitude, that's more likely when we're going to be finding ourselves beating ourselves up. What we're invited to do when we are in this place of being self-defeatist or being really disappointed is to learn how to sit with the disappointment rather than the defeating kind of, I don't want to feel this disappointment, so I'm just going to demand that I accept myself, right? So it can be helpful to think about when we're kind of working on this. It's like, is it self-acceptance? Like, are you finding acceptance for this situation? Are you finding acceptance that this is how you navigated it? Or are you giving up in order to protect yourself from being with the disappointment? Right? Which in some ways we can think about that as learned helplessness, like we're coming at it from like a helpless place. Like, I'm so tired that this is how I am and I don't know how to change and I don't know what to do. So I'm going to try to just accept. That's actually very different than the attitude of acceptance, which is, I don't know why I'm like this. I want to keep knowing about myself and keep understanding myself and keep trying to imagine like what may be going on for me. And in that grappling, I'm actually creating space for more of myself, which means that I'm able to tolerate more of reality. And the reality is that we are all disappointing and all relationships will disappoint us, and that disappointment is a real integral part of life. So if you're trying to use self-acceptance as a weapon against your disappointment, you're not going to find that that's going to work. It's not a long-term solution for your disappointment. And it's what it's going to do. It's going to create for you this narrative that you now really struggle with self-acceptance, because that approach is never going to work. But then we're going to try it, and then we're going to sit with and be like, see, I suck at accepting myself. And then we're going to punish ourselves even more. Do you see that? And then we kind of create this cycle in ourselves that, again, really, really defeats the purpose of what self-acceptance is meant to do for us. So if you're noticing yourself only leaning towards this idea of self-acceptance when it's coming out of like a place of wanting to give up, or a sense of feeling defeated, or a sense of feeling disappointment, the invitation there is, can we really step into the defeat and the disappointment and really let ourselves be in that, and ironically accept that? And when we can accept that disappointment, and when we can accept the defeatist and the learned helplessness, and when we can accept that this is where we are right now, the irony in that is how we learn to be more real with ourselves, to be more of ourselves in our lives, to be more expansive. You see that? Self-acceptance just does not look the way that the ego thinks it looks. The ego thinks it looks like it's a detachment from reality. It's a way in which nothing can affect us anymore. And we really like that fantasy because we are often so encumbered by life. We are often feeling so overwhelmed by our experiences of life that, of course, we're going to want to do something to soften this, to diminish some of this input of life. And so we use this idea of self-acceptance and this kind of philosophical idea of presence to really berate ourselves for having thoughts and feelings. So the more that we can kind of grapple with, I actually am really struggling to like this part of myself, and I wonder why that is. The more that we actually face the ways in which we have a hard time accepting ourselves, the irony is that then the more we're developing the capacity to accept ourselves. And that kind of goes into my next point here, which is that we really can't accept what we refuse to see. Right? So if we're going to talk about accepting life the way that it is, that means we have to be able to see life the way that it is. And it can be very, very hard to see life the way that it is. It's very hard to see ourselves in an accurate way. We often do not have an accurate perception of ourselves. And what we're kind of terrified, I think, secretly when it comes to this idea of self-acceptance, why I think some of us really struggle with it, is that we think that if we accept these ugly, difficult part of ourselves, we're acknowledging that this is all that we are, that we are fully these ugly parts, and that by accepting them, not only are we admitting that it's who we really are, and that there's no opportunity then for change. And so we're really terrified. So even though we may want it on the one hand, we may then find ourselves being really terrified of it on the other hand. It's important then to keep in mind that by acknowledging and facing our most difficult part of ourselves, our hateful thoughts, our vengeful thoughts, our rage, our hatred, our anger, the more that we can actually face it and be with it and experience it and notice it, what we're doing is we're seeing ourselves more clearly with all parts of ourselves rather than just the parts that make us feel good. And that is actually now a more holistic way of relating to ourselves, right? It's much more holistic that I am capable of both anger and kindness, then I'm only capable of kindness, and I'm going to cut off all of my angry parts, and I'm just going to try, to kind of narrow my existence to only these palatable parts of ourselves. It's really interesting in my work sitting with patients how often we really filter our minds in the presence of another, and find that there are thoughts and feelings we can't even bear to have, let alone name or say, because we've been told that even just having the thought is bad or wrong, which is interesting because if you think about therapy, right, it's like this limited time-bound space. It's an hour or two a week, would that have very little impact in the rest of your life. For example, right, like if you say I'm really angry at my mom to your therapist, like your mom isn't going to necessarily find out. Like you can say all sorts of things, but we're so scared that even just saying that I'm angry at my mom, now suddenly we're going to feel all the guilt. We're going to imagine the mom is there, the internalized mom, like we're going to have so many. So we would rather not even have the thought. So we really limit how much of ourselves we can even see, we can even tolerate. And again, that's the work. The work is to be able to name, to speak, to bear witness, or to have someone bear witness to these difficult thoughts and feelings, to air them out, to kind of give space for them so that they, one, have less power over our lives, and two, so that we may find that, I have anger, but I'm not angry person. Like having anger, having spite, these are all parts of myself, but they don't actually make up all of who I am. I'm actually more robust than that. I actually have these parts and these parts. And by having more of myself, by allowing more of myself, it's easier to accept more of ourselves. Again, we can't accept what we refuse to see. So it's important in our work to expand what we can see. And that can be very, very challenging, again, because of those quotes by Egan and Bion. Okay, so there's two more things that I want to make sure that we talk about in this idea of self-acceptance and how to move into more self-acceptance that doesn't come from this ego place of just shaming ourselves for not being able to self-accept. So one of the things that I think we don't really understand when it comes to self-acceptance or accepting reality, whether, again, it's ourselves or the situation or the other person, is that it requires actually a whole lot of grieving. Grief is an integral part of doing this work, grieving who we are not, grieving our potential, should we have had a different childhood, grieving the parents that we didn't have or wanted to have and couldn't make out of our parents. And then now as adults, we may find ourselves grieving opportunities missed, doors closing, relationships ending. Like the more we grow older, the more there is to grieve. And grieving, mourning, acknowledging all of that is not, allows us to create more space for what is. And that can be really hard. It can be very hard to grieve. And I've done many podcast episodes on it. And I'll link to the show notes so that you can listen to those episodes. But grieving can be really hard because, one, it's a very active process of naming and talking and grappling with what we didn't get, what we don't have, what we wish that we have. And it can be hard because then we have such a culture where you're not supposed to have regrets, right? Like you're supposed to not ever regret. You're not supposed to have remorse. Like you're supposed to be able to just accept everything that's happened because you are now where you are, and you wouldn't be where you are if you didn't do what you did. And so don't regret. But part of grieving is naming the regret and naming the things that you won't have and won't experience, and parts of yourself that will not get an opportunity to exist as much as you've wished for because you chose a different career path. I mean, there's limits to life. Life is filled with limits, and this is not a sexy thing. And the self-help world tries to instill within us this idea that we are limitless beings. The spiritual community will say, right, like we are limitless beings, and it actually doesn't go against that. We are limitless. Our capacity, there is a beautiful way in which our dreams, our desires, are important to hold on to, and can be for many of us an important form of forward movement. But part of being human is also the fact that there are limits, there are boundaries, that we won't always get what we want, and that loss is inevitable. This is, again, part of that kind of grappling with reality. The more that we can grapple with the ways in which we push against reality and have all these sort of fantastical ideas of what life should be, and the more that we can kind of face it and name it, the more we're going to be able to then see reality for what it is. We often think that seeing reality, again, is this idea of being defeated. It's like, that's how life is. I gotta just accept it. But that's not it. When we can really see reality fully, it's not defeated at all. It's like looking at nature and being defeated that winter is here. Like, that is very depressing. Winter can be very depressing time. Everything's closed down and it's cold, etc., etc. But that's not all of reality, right? There is also spring and summer and fall. There are all these other seasons. And if we're like, oh, that's what life is just winter, we just have to accept it, we're missing the point. Which is that accepting reality is accepting that there is good and bad, that there is difficulties and joy, and that this is all within the realm of what it means to be human. So acceptance, when we say, how do I accept? How do I learn how to accept? Well, we learn how to accept by looking at all of the things that we have a hard time accepting and grappling with it. Actively grappling, actively engaging with the difficulty of accepting it. I have a really hard time accepting that. Let me give an example here. I have a really hard time accepting that my partner prefers to, I'm trying to make up an example here, prefers to spend his time playing video games instead of being with me. And I should just accept it, that this is just who he is, right? This is the way we tend to engage in this conversation, because I'm tired of telling him to spend time with me and he won't spend time with me, so I should just accept it. What I would reframe there, or what I would suggest instead, is looking at, well, what are the feelings that come up when you find him choosing video games over you? What is that like for you? What do you notice? What do you experience? Frustration, anger? What comes up for you? What are the parallels in your past relationships? Maybe you've always felt chosen over, and how interesting that you continue to find partners that choose something over you. Or maybe you're interpreting it as being chosen over, but it may not actually be that he is choosing over. And maybe there's all these other ways that he's prioritizing you that you're not seeing, because all you're seeing is this. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why you have to be hyper focused on the ways in which the people in your life are choosing you over, to kind of fit into the way in which you see the world. Now, if you see the world as being constantly being chosen over, you're not actually seeing reality, right? Because the reality is that there probably are ways that people choose you over something, and then there's definitely ways that people are choosing other things over you, but you're only seeing a narrow part of it. And so then that becomes very interesting. Why is that? How is that serving you? What function is that playing for you in your life? What does that facilitate for you? Maybe then it helps assuage your own guilt, because you have a hard time prioritizing your husband, and blaming him for not prioritizing you feels easier than grappling with the ways in which you struggle to prioritize him. Do you see how, whoa, that became so much more interesting, so much more expansive, so many more thoughts and feelings have space there than just being like, I should just accept him for who he is. It's like a different way of seeing and understanding. And notice that I didn't say anything about acceptance in all of that conversation. But if you find yourself really engaging with it, you'll probably find that you won't even notice that you're just more accepting of his video gaming, that you're no longer as threatened by it, that it feels easier to say, hey, I'm really lonely, or I'm really miss you. Can we hang out sometime? Can we prioritize that? Like naming your needs, like all of that may organically come as you focus on your thoughts and feelings and expanding it, than just being in like, I should just accept. And I think that limitation, like limiting all of this diverse and complicated feelings to I should just accept, is a way, again, that we try to collapse something that's very complicated. And this will lead me to my final point here of the podcast, which is part of self-acceptance, part of what we struggle with and why we try to accept and try to bring acceptance into the equation, is because it's very hard to stay in the wanting of something, right? Like it can be very hard to stay in like, I want something to change. I want my husband to change how he relates to me. And I'm very frustrated by this want because it's not happening right away. We often have an impatience. And we often have this sense that if it doesn't happen right away, it means that it's something bad. It means that our want isn't valid. Developing a relationship with our desires, our wants, our longing is really surprisingly challenging. And we try to often collapse that conversation by moving into, oh, I can't have what I want, so I need to just accept that I'm not going to get what I want. The problem with that is that wanting, desire, it's so interconnected to our life force. It's connected to what it means to be human and forward momentum. And I think when we stay in the wanting of something, in the longing of something, again, we're making space for more of ourselves rather than trying to use self-acceptance as a way to defend against the difficulties in making the changes that we want to make. And so it's going to be important if you're really struggling with your wants and desires, and to kind of continue to let yourself have feelings about how frustrating it is. Like, it's so wild that we so quickly say, like, if something can't change, like the weather, I can't, it's going to rain on my wedding day, I can't now have feelings about it. I just have to accept it. It is what it is. We're so quick to move into trying to get out of the feelings and going into the acceptance, again, because we have this idea that if we could just accept, then we won't struggle. But if it's going to rain on your wedding day, that sucks. I'm like, yeah, of course, you're going to have feelings about it. Let yourself have feelings about it. Let yourself be frustrated. Throw a little tantrum. Cry. Get angry. Get it out. Let it go, let it come in. Let you feel it. And then when you create space for your feelings, what will probably happen is that then you'll be able to move into, okay, what are we going to do about this, right? Like, okay, how can we salvage this? What can we do here? When we're talking about longings and things that can change, like our partner in their video game, can we have thoughts and feelings while that change is taking place? Or are we going to get angry and then move into acceptance? Whether the thing can change or can't change. Either way, moving into acceptance means consistently engaging with our feelings about the thing. And when we create space for our feelings, we will then find maybe a different way of relating to the thing, right? Like, when we allow ourselves to be fully where we are with our thoughts and feelings about the thing, maybe we'll find ways to relate to the thing differently. And that's the magic where self-acceptance can do its real alchemy. It's really amazing what type of ways we can step into acceptance when we first give lots of space for all of the ways that we have a hard time accepting. And maybe self-acceptance isn't the right thing in the moment. Maybe it will happen organically. Maybe we have to grieve more first. Maybe we have to stay in touch with the longing and the desire of it in order for us to alchemize and move something in our lives. I want us to be really mindful of when we're trying to use acceptance as a way to kind of defeat ourselves, to feed our ego's sense of we're not doing enough, and where we're using self-acceptance actually to create more spaciousness. Because when we stop trying to insist that we be easier going and actually make room for the ways in which we're not easygoing, the irony is that we then slowly become easier going, if that's your goal. That's not a lot of people's goals. A lot of people's goals is to be more in touch with their sensitivity and more in touch with themselves, not to be this kind of enlightened, disconnected person. Because we often think that enlightenment means to be disconnected. And that's a real shame. It's a real shame, because to be human is to be intimately connected and expand our capacity to be connected with ourselves. And what we will find when we do that is that then we're able to be more present. Because to be more present isn't to be happier. To be more present isn't to ensure that only good things happen. To be more present means to be more capable of tolerating the variety of human experiences that we're having in any given moment. And that is really a truly magical thing. So thank you for reclaiming self-acceptance and acceptance as a whole with me on this first episode of season 6 of Reclaim. I'm so delighted that you are here, that you are listening. Thank you so much. Whether you've been a long-time listener or you're just hopping into this episode for the first time to check out this podcast, I really appreciate you. You can tune into this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, but you can also check it out on YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for being here. Please feel free, of course, as always, gotta say it because it's true. subscribe, like, rate, review. It does mean the world to me and also to the algorithm. And thank you so much, and catch you next time.